For our goals, one is the utilization, so who's utilizing the services that are being offered. But then number two, it's what are those barriers to services, and then we wanted to be able to gauge the volunteer interest. And you'll see that those three common themes we then broke down within each of the go-throughs. So that the next 5 questions that we were asked, we kind of kept those 3 goals in the forefront because we wanted it to be more about information gathering. So how do we start to gather the information and create a platform that's going to be able to be utilized consistently to gather and then regather information? So how do you keep getting information that's updated? And we would love to do it through a web technology or an IT technology that allows for you to actually ask the first question, which is, are you a client of services? And that breaks down into, here's your next 10 or 12 questions that are being asked. And then, do you want to volunteer? And so how do we actually build this off of it? Because many of in the group have seen where the clients are actually the volunteers helping out at the food pantry, maybe the next go around or at, later in life. So how do we go through and gather that information? Our cohorts are the users, volunteers, administrators of the food pantry, the social service entities, and then funders who are actually choosing to fund those locations. So those were the 5 major groups that we wanted to target. We would like for technology-enabled data entry at the food pantries. So whether that's a kiosk that's located at each of the food pantries or iPads that are connected to web-based that allow for quick, easy access of easy to understand questions. And our locations, we of course went way overboard and came up with 42 locations to work through. Key services, key ideas are pop-up locations, so actually popping up in an area, so maybe at the mall or at the festa or other things that happen in the community, and targeting places that veterans, even the homeless and where they're going, because they probably are not going to be able to access or utilize much of the food that's coming available, but they probably have a high need. So how do we start to gather that? And then begin to hit the ethnic populations. Our questions, I seriously did not write single spaced on this page, so don't worry, we're almost through. The questions we're asking, one are, what are the services, your hours of operation and eligibility criteria, so that's the main things we want to gather. A lot of that's already gathered in the food pantry survey that's collected, or the information that's updated each year, but now how do we start to get that information even more frequently updated? Ethnic options, would you like to have ethnic options? Do you see access to the food choices that you're normally interested in? How do we meet your needs, or how does this food pantry meet your needs? So helping them to gather that information, because I think it would be really helpful in talking to a lot of organizations. They may not always be asking a patient or client satisfaction survey, and so how do we start to get some of that information gathered through this tool? And then the last piece would be, how would you benefit from education around nutrition and preparation materials, and how would you like to receive those? So is it a cooking demonstration that actually happens at the food pantry? So if everybody shows up, here's the hour that the food pantry is open and the first 10 minutes are a cooking demonstration? Or is it here's a piece of paper that you take with you and we put it down in your bag that you're taking home, and here's how you prepare the 17 items that are in your bag? So that was so all of that comes together in a food pantry survey and a client survey that we break down separately. And then we really wanted to get into the volunteer piece. And so our group said, we get to come up with one idea. And the one idea was adopt a food pantry. So working with local organizations in partnership with maybe the chamber to actually say, we're gonna work with this organization to adopt this food pantry, allow for creative community service credits for their employees. Maybe it's if you donate an hour, you get a half hour of leave time. Is there some creative incentive that could be done to be able to adopt a food pantry and benefit the organizations and other groups that are coming into the community? And of course, student projects, cooking demos, all that kind of stuff. Any questions?
So our group was a little bit divided as to whether this should be one survey or several surveys that we would want to put out, but since it's a broad community survey, we definitely identified several audiences. So current clients of pantries and pantry staff, also teachers, school workers, primary healthcare providers, potential volunteers also. And we agree with some of the questions that also came up, the questions we'd like to ask in the survey. what issues or problems are people having in using the services or accessing the services. And we identified groups of people who we believe may not feel comfortable using services such as veterans. So we added to that refugees, immigrants, people new in Pennsylvania or Scranton, people who don't speak English, people who are re-entering the community out of a prison term or a rehab center, and people who are undocumented. And an idea that was brought up in the group was that perhaps instead of a survey, we could be thinking about focus groups that would be pantry staff, teachers, etc., as opposed to the community survey.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Don Webster. We had a really good conversation. I'm going to leave you with 3 thoughts right from the beginning, and then we'll tell you some of the details. But from a tech perspective, one of the interesting things is we like to know who our audience is. In this particular case, anybody is the audience, right? And so that actually presents a challenge to technologists, because if anybody is the audience, then everybody has an opinion. Okay, so we got to structure this in some simple ways. So 3 thoughts: usable, consistent, sustainable. That's the kind of stuff that our group started talking about to say, if we're going to move down a technology path, usable, consistent, sustainable. We started to get into some conversations around, okay, if we know who our stakeholders are, it's everybody, how do we move forward? And so one of the things we talked about in our group was, can we identify ownership? And Gretchen, you had some great conversations about the Weinberg and creating information. But then what we started to talk about is that information available? Is it consistent? And how do we support it? So we talked a lot about how are we going to be able to start something, but more importantly, how are we going to be able to maintain it, and how are we going to be able to continue it? Okay, so those were the essence of our conversations. One of the things that Leo said, give him some love here, he said, it was really good. Our stakeholders are really 2 broad populations. So it's consumers of food and consumers of information. Okay, so that's who our target audience is that we need to work with. We need to create ownership, because ultimately we got to figure out how we're going to make this happen, and then who's going to do the work. Thank you.
Hi, Tony Bartocci, the second half of technology, which we shared very similar discussions as far as the target, almost verbatim. I think moving on to how and where they'll get information, we know that there's information that exists in a variety of places. So we talked about really adopting a universal kind of link or approach where these offshoots that are pointing people in certain directions all kind of adopt a similar, instead of pointing into their own exclusive little portal here or there, that we adopt a streamlined kind of funnel of information. We also talked about utilizing current social media, like the Facebooks of the world, which is a wonderful suggestion. Good work over here. To the woman who claims she doesn't use technology. But using that, I guess, as far as really spanning that generation, not putting all of our eggs in that basket, but I think as a way to help disseminate information. Also talked about different maybe dedicated phone lines or people that we're providing phones to. Maybe should we come up with some centralized web application, have that something that's preloaded or already readily accessible as a shortcut on those devices to the centralized platform as we've been talking about. Also talked about breaking down the barriers that are these weird vernaculars that are happening in different pockets of information that we call something over here for this type of assistance and this type of assistance, that we really streamline the semantics across that. So when you're searching for help and you're finding it easily at a glance, anyone knows what you're talking about, not just certain acronyms, or you're getting lost in that alphabet soup of different organizations. Who will gather and update the info along with the stuff that the first group mentioned. We talked maybe about commissioning a position. But knowing that can be rather intimidating for one person. So maybe it's kind of a divide and conquer approach where this centralized platform has dedicated stakeholders at a variety of different organizations where they can log in and be encouraged on a weekly, daily, monthly basis to update their particular portion, not the entire beast that would be this centralized platform. Also talked about maybe enlisting some type of internal IT partner, but having a centralized moderator to make sure that we're poking those agencies that may be a little bit out of date or maybe haven't updated in a while, but also making sure that we're kind of controlling the information in a clean way and making sure that it's accurate. That's all.
Top priorities, we pretty much were in agreement on fresh food and fresh produce. There was a lot of talk about low sodium options, heart healthy options, things that were diabetic friendly. We talked a lot about starting with the least processed food available for distribution, and then really making a hierarchy type of thing of, if we can't give out fresh produce, can we give out fresh produce that was frozen? And what are the steps up to the best option? Other than the cost, other hurdles we came up with were lack of storage and refrigeration at the food pantries. Lack of consistency in availability from location to location is a big one. You might be able to go down the street and get milk, but the other food pantry across town has bread, and can you go to both, and how do you get there? Educating donors about the types of things to donate to the food pantries. Having foods that can be stored longer at home, like giving someone a bag of potatoes that could last up far longer than a head of lettuce. And another hurdle we found was staffing for the pantries, and also staffing for the gardens who are producing to donate to the pantries. Current resources that could be better used. The greenhouse project, we talked about the ability to grow during the winter and the resources for that. Creative new ideas, community gardens. I was at the North Pocono Library last week. They have a really cool garden up there that they donate their produce to the food pantry. And also purchasing food from a lower cost, either from farmers markets at the end of the day or from grocery stores who are going to get rid of the produce. Working more effectively with existing providers. We talked about collaborating efforts with staffing and sharing staff members. And that's it.
I'm Gretchen Huntz, and one of the priority foods that we talked about, aside from the fresh produce, was the need for ready-to-eat foods, either for one of two reasons, either because we have people in need who don't have housing, or perhaps they have housing but they don't have water, or they don't have electricity, or they don't have stoves, or they don't have the skill or the interest or the time. So the need for ready-to-eat or prepared foods, in addition to all of those fresh foods, because what's available currently, if it's not fresh, then it's probably not healthy. There's a lack of ready-to-eat foods that are healthy. Other than costs, we talked about just the importance of getting food and moving it very quickly so that it stays fresh and it gets to the end user and consumer fresh, and it isn't wasted. So the need to have a really fast-moving system to get the food out. Another barrier that we talked about is culture and language and familiarity. So having consumers who don't know what the food is that we're giving out, or don't understand the language so that they know what to do with the food, even if we're presenting that information to them. And the need for education overall about what is this, what do I do with it, how do I prepare it, and will my family eat it? Number 3, the resources that could be better used. We talked about excess and local home gardeners, home gardens. We talked about the nutrition education that does take place in our pantries and our soup kitchens and places, but that there's just not enough people, enough educators to get to everybody. So what could we do around perhaps videotaping that and sharing that information in another way? We talked about underutilization of the food bank because of transportation issues, and so what could, how do we get more food from the food bank to the pantry, or how do we get the pantry to come and pick up more food because it's there but it's not necessarily getting picked up and getting to the pantry. Creative ideas, we talked a lot about the concept of having a food hub or a central processing kitchen where fresh foods would be turned into the ready-to-eat frozen or some other way preserved food items that could be given out. And we also talked about hydroponics as a possibility for a new source of food. We didn't talk about number 5, sorry, we ran out of time. But with regards to geographical gaps, we talked about mobile pantries and the use of a mobile unit that would go to neighborhoods and housing developments and places where we don't have, you know, a permanent brick and mortar building. That's all. Thank you.
My name is Kathy Hardaway, and the two issues, we kept trying to simplify it, and it really did help us tremendously. We were trying to ask the question, with transportation, you need to bring the food to the people, but then you also need to get the people to the food. So we were trying to look at it two different ways. And the first thing that came to people's mind was Amazon, because they've really done a good job, and the drone systems we didn't think would necessarily work. So then we went to the next best thing we thought in this area was maybe a food truck. Because we know that Weinberg does have food trucks that go to the neighborhoods. And we thought that would be a great way to get different food, particular to some of the housing developments that are far away from transportation, far away from stores, and also trying to simplify it so we keep reminding ourselves there are food deserts, which we really need to consider. Also thought about what population and senior citizens were a concern, and of course Meals on Wheels came up so far as the senior citizens were concerned, and really thought if we want to test the population, test some delivery options, that may be a place to start. Talked about food pop-ups in given neighborhoods, and really felt that the community engagement technology people could help there. Just throwing things outside the box so that you don't embarrass yourself when you say it. Some people mentioned, is there a way to work with the post office? They're out and about in neighborhoods all the time doing delivering. School buses came up, because surely school buses, they have different runs, but then they're empty. They may have some time to either drop off food or bring people to the food. Also talked about the county systems so far as coordinated transportation and Colts, and thought of those big brown trucks so far as UPS delivery. So those were kind of out of the box things, just saying, are there ways, because there's all kinds of transportation out there, how can we use that so far as food delivery or getting people to the food? Also, Lyft came up, Uber, and I never knew Uber has Uber Eats in some of the larger metropolitan areas where they just deliver food. Another thing that always comes up are volunteers versus employees. Is it sustainable to hire people to do this? Talked about some of the senior worker programs, Pathstone and ARP. And then wanted to ask ourselves a question about trends. Analyzing if we're going to get people to food or bring them to the food. Clearly there are certain times a month we know when the checks come out, and the food banks know that is not their busiest time. But the third and fourth weeks of the month, you really need to have a focus so far as food availability is concerned. And getting food can be a full-time effort for people. So when is the best time with all the other constraints that they have on their time? What time of day is best, and also are weekends available? Menu selection also came up, because many times the food banks have very similar foods. So you really need to know there are differences in what senior citizens need as opposed to what young parents need. So to know menu selection so that if we're taking them to places, the food is appropriate for that population. That covers, I believe, most of what we talked about.
Karen Foster. We actually took a look at seriously taking the food to the people. We also had mentioned the Uber food as a model. And then we also said, you know, there are people going to these homes, most of these homes anyway. Why don't we look at subsidizing them so that they can deliver maybe once a week with Meals on Wheels, home health care facilities, children's rooms, etc. And also making sure that when we're transporting people, that they have the proper information so they know which foods are available where. And as far as the food deserts, number 2, suggestion of having a food pantry at the intermobile center to kind of get those crossover people that are after work, maybe they can pick up a few items there before going home. Collaborating better with the county county agencies so that we have food availability there. So if they're there for an appointment, they can pick up food at the same time. as education and locations, reaching out to employers. It was mentioned that there is an employer in Southside, and they do a lot of counseling as well as employment because they are new immigrants to the city. So maybe reaching out to them to see what the need is for them, and maybe having that as a distribution site to host so they can pick it up at work. And then again, making sure that we have a way to get the low-income housing units more frequent fresh food access. And then outside the box, we had a thought of having corporations adopt a neighborhood to help with the transportation of food. And then we also talked about neighbor to neighbor or family to family having a volunteer initiative, so that maybe for a month, someone could volunteer to make sure that that bag of food gets to their senior neighbor. And then also get people to grow their own food to reduce the need of transportation. Thank you.